Okay, as I said, my name is Rich Schneider, and just a little bit of introduction. I lived in the county for 49 years. I moved here from Washington, D.C. My wife at the time was Polish and Italian in her background, and she moved to Wallowa County, and she said, there aren't any trees here, and there aren't any people that are different. Everybody's named Daggett and Johnson, and all you've got is Christmas trees. And the Jagelskis moved to town, and she was elated. Oh, good, we've got some Eastern Europeans. About that time, Ralph, and not quite that time, but over the last 30 or 40 years, this, of course, is the homeland of the Nez Perce Wallowa band, or Joseph band of the Nez Perce Indians. And by the way, if you've got some time, we've got a little exhibit up on top. The Nez Perce Indians, when I moved here in 1971, weren't very welcome here. They'd been here. They were gone. They were history. Is that pretty right, Jim? About that time? Things have changed, fortunately. And Nez Perce has a presence here with Nez Perce tribal fisheries, and we in Wallowa have the Nez Perce Homeland Project, and we have a little amazing sculpture out here called Return, which is about the Nez Perce coming back to Wallowa country. So I moved to a place that looked really pretty homogeneous. You guys know what homogeneous means, right? Homogeneous means like your milk. When I was a kid, the cream was on top and then the milk. And then they homogenized it and put it all together, okay? So this looks like a homogeneous place. But I want you, as Reverend David Bruce speaks, to think about those instances in your own lives where difference and discrimination have been issues, whether it's incidents, whether it's people you know, whether it's people in your family. And differences are not just being Japanese and being thrown into an internment camp, or being Indian and thrown into a boarding school. Differences can be a lot more subtle. And I see, I'm an old-time feminist, and I just went to a workshop on white male privilege. And so, oftentimes, you women were different just because you were women in our culture, as far as the law was concerned. You didn't always have the vote. Our exhibit here this month is women, and we're celebrating 100 years of you getting the vote. You actually had the vote in Oregon in 1912, and you had the vote in Lostine in 1903, but that's another story. So, David, he might be a doctor too, for all I know, but Reverend David Bruce from the Christian Church and Enterprise has his own journey and his own story. And I think this is the place we're going to start, and then there'll be time for discussion. So think about it, and as he talks about his journey, you think about your own journey, and we'll have a lively conversation afterwards. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, David.
They've asked me to speak from behind the microphone, and so I shall. I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to tell you that in many ways I'm trying to figure out why I'm doing this and how I got into this. But Mike reminds me that I said yes, and so that's enough. I want to go ahead and share with the students. Okay, hang in there. I want everybody to understand, I think, kind of how we have envisioned this. I'm going to relate to you my story, my journey. And then I'm going to go ahead and take some time and relate to you 4, maybe even 5 different dynamics that I've seen within Wallowa County, or that I've at least done a little bit of study on concerning Wallowa County, concerning this idea of how we deal, or how we don't deal, with differences. And then when we get to the end, I'm going to pose some questions, and I hope that they are open-ended so that we can then have discussion. What I really hope is, as I express my journey to you, I hope that it encourages you to go through your own journey, so that you can go ahead and make this time to be a real self-introspection of your own way dealing with differences. Some of us deal with them very openly. Some of us go ahead and deal with differences by pushing the whole issue aside and ignoring the whole thing. I hope that during my expression of my sharing of my journey to you, that I'll help us all to understand the various dynamics and the various differences that we are called to face throughout our own walks, throughout our lifetime. It was a few months ago that I was sitting at my desk and Mike called me, director of Fishtrap. He said, "Would your church allow us to have our big read kickoff in your building again?" I said, "Sure, what's the book?" And he said, "When the Emperor Was Divine." It's a book that deals with the internment camps of the Japanese during World War II. And that really touched a button in my life. You see, my mother had Japanese friends who were removed from Sunnyside, Washington, and placed into camps. Her friend had given her Japanese dolls for safekeeping and had never come back to claim them. When my mother died, I became the inheritor of those items. My mother's uncle spent time as one of the higher officers charged with the running of an internment camp. We had talked in my visitation with him about what it was like. He said it was the most awful experience of his life. Mike got really excited about what I had shared with him. He came over with the book, and I took the evening and I read it, and it simply resonated with me. It brought up topics and themes that I believe we all should recognize in our own lives. It has the purpose of challenging us to remember that we must learn to deal with differences. And so I want to begin by sharing with you that I'm not an expert in the field. The only expert that I am an expert of is my own journey. But it's something that I would like to share with you. I was born and raised in Walla Walla, Washington. A few minorities in those schools in the 1960s and 70s, except you did take notice when the migrants came to town. But they were all at the migrant camp. And so they were just kind of a novelty in my lifetime. But in my church youth group, I enjoyed friendships with David DeSiga, whose father had been born in Mexico, and with Richard Washington, who happened to be black. Growing up, I was fascinated by the civil rights movement. I was totally taken in by the ministry and influence of Martin Luther King Jr. I was challenged as I ate dinner at the table and watched as blacks were attacked by fire hoses, dogs, clubs, gas, and assorted other weapons. I watched as the faces of those who would persecute them while they were wearing their crosses. I was appalled at the prejudice and harm that I saw inflicted upon those individuals. I was stunned when Robert Kennedy was shot. I was crushed when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. I had been taught to sing red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in His sight. And what I saw on my television in my world did not correspond to the words of that Sunday school song. I grew up, I went to Walla Walla High School. It was the time of the Vietnam War. I enrolled myself in ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps, once a week. Every week during my high school education, I put on a uniform and I studied military. I studied military tactics. I was preparing to enter on into the military. It was kind of an oddity. I would wear my uniform and I would hop on my motorcycle that had a bumper sticker on the back. I made a little handle so that I could put a bumper sticker on the back. Me in my military uniform, riding a motorcycle that proclaimed, "War is not healthy for children and other living things." In 1971, my high school put on a blanket invitation for students to be host families to 2 Japanese students from Yamada High School in Yokohama, Japan. I asked my mom if it would be okay, and she said, "You have to get permission from your dad." He was very hesitant to say yes. I worked on him for weeks. He finally did. I didn't think anything of it. It was a 2-week experience, and my father was very aloof during the first few days, and then he warmed up to those 2 Japanese boys. Soon he saw Yumi for the rest of their visit. It was a great experience, and I took up an interest in all things Japanese. Afterwards, my mother informed me that it had been quite different and quite difficult for my father. After all, he had served in the South Pacific in World War II. He watched some of his friends die in attacks by the Japanese upon his ship. That had never entered my mind. In 1975, I spent the summer in Japan, visiting various mission sites. It was the first time that I had ever experienced being a minority. Less than 1% of the Japanese population is Christian, and I was a long-haired, bearded American who stood out and above most of the population. I was accustomed to having children point at me and cry out, "Gaijin, Gaijin!" Rough translation, foreigner, outsider, enemy. Common thought, you're not one of us. I went off to college and I made friends with black students, but all of them were from Africa. Kenya, Ethiopia, Nigeria. In Eugene, Oregon in the 1970s, there was still prejudice to overcome, and I can remember some of the rude comments that were aimed at my friends. I still recall that they were not made to feel welcome in some of the churches that we attended. But I really didn't dwell on it too much, nor did I change my life much in light of it. I graduated, and in 1979 I traveled back to East Tennessee in order to take up seminary training. I accepted a job in Greenville, Tennessee, Upper East Tennessee. I want to say this about Upper East Tennessee. It is absolutely a beautiful place. The Appalachian Mountains are gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous, and it is filled with wonderful people. I lived half an hour from Irwin, Tennessee. Irwin, Tennessee. The only place that anybody knows has ever lynched an elephant. Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey brought their circus through. And there were some kids from Irwin that were pelting a baby elephant with rocks and sticks. And the mother elephant reached out and grabbed one of those boys, lifted it up, and then threw him down and stomped it to death. And the Irwin folks brought up a train, and they brought up a crane, and they tied a choker set around that mama elephant's neck, and they hung her up until she had died. Irwin had another reputation. You didn't want to be black in Irwin after sundown. Our high school would actually schedule all afternoon sports events against Irwin so that we could send black students back home early if it was close to sundown. I'll always remember the night that I heard a report in my church from a missionary to Africa who talked about the marvelous response to the gospel in the country of Ethiopia. And I stunned the congregation when I stated, why are we getting so excited about people coming to Christ that we would not welcome in our own worship times? I survived the vote to fire me. It began a discussion on faith and race and the practices of the church. I recall back in 1983, I took my first pulpit ministry in Dayton, Washington, and as I was walking along a street, a highway maintenance man called out to me, and I went out and I talked with him in the middle of the road. It was Mr. Washington, the father of my boyhood friend. As I was talking with him, I looked up, and out of a store came Mr. DeSiga. He was the father of my Hispanic boyhood friend. And a couple of days later, someone came up to me and said, what were you doing talking to those colored folks the other day? And I responded, those are my friends, and I had invited them to come and worship with us. The man would leave. Mr. DeSiga would become a faithful member of my congregation. It was a few years later that I had to face another crisis. We had a wonderful English teacher in Dayton, Washington. He was gay. Everybody knew that Russ was gay, but he didn't try to be militant about it. He really didn't push it out there very far. And so people were willing to, quote, put up with him because he was a great English teacher. Russ went through a time, and there was a sting in another community, and some things came out about Russ and inappropriate behavior that he had taken, and he was promptly fired. Russ lived about 3 houses down from my church building. I walked past Russ's house every day when I went home, and I began to talk to Russ more and more frequently because everybody else was pulling away from him. He grew wonderful roses, he had a wonderful sense of history, and we would talk about all kinds of things together. When Russ let me know that he had AIDS, he asked if I would go ahead and minister to him in his dying. By the way, Rick, I do have a doctorate. It's in grief studies. I specialized in trying to learn how to help people die and how to minister to people after they've lost the death of a loved one. I ministered to Russ. I shared with him, and one day he went ahead and he asked me a special question. He said, "Dave, would you do my funeral?" "I will, Russ, on one condition." "What's that?" "During your service, I would have to go ahead and put in my proclamation that my doing your service did not negate my understanding that a gay lifestyle is not biblical." And he smiled, and we held hands, and he said, "And I wouldn't expect anything less." I offered the use of my church building. That one almost got me too. It was the largest service that had been done for quite a period of time. And I went ahead and I shared what I needed to share. And there were a lot of people that immediately took offense at me. And some people that appreciated me. As I ministered in Dayton, I learned a sad truth. It had once been the place where the KKK had held an organizational meeting for Columbia County. I denounced our history and held a service in repentance of it. I did more study, found out that many of the Christian churches in Northeast Oregon and Southeast Washington had also opened their doors to the KKK for organizational purposes. When I came to Enterprise in 2002, I learned that this Christian church had also been used as a meeting place for locals to discuss whether or not a local chapter of the KKK should be established in Wallowa County. The Wallowa County chapter was never officially organized. Instead, people traveled over to Elgin, which was where the nearest meetings were held, but there were local parades, picnics, and local advertisements in our newspaper which promoted KKK. 17 years ago, I stated that I was going to be doing a Martin Luther King Jr. Sunday emphasis. And one of the people from my congregation came up and said, "You do know that you're in Wallowa County, don't you?" The implication was that I needn't bother bringing that subject into this county culture. I did anyway. Most years, I do preach a sermon on discrimination, or on the call for Christians to seek justice in the world, or some other related theme. And I am prone to display this display of postcards as well, which is very, very meaningful to me. And in many ways, over the past 18 years, I have been challenged to become aware of the dynamics of Wallowa County. Cultural dynamics which help to mold spiritual lives. It's easy to go ahead and to see that there were at least four different subjects, in my opinion, in our history that should be relatively easy to acknowledge. And those four different dynamics I want to use as illustrations. First, our history with the Nez Perce. Second, our history with the Chinese. 3, our history with Black Americans. The best treatment of this dynamic comes from Gwen Price's History of the Maxville. Black Americans brought in from the Deep South that joined the logging town north of Wallowa. And also our history of the KKK within our county. I want us to go ahead and to take a brief look at all of those, because each one of those has some effect on who we are living in this county. I hope Baker City can find some application of it. What I do in the books up here, and I guess what I'll go ahead and share is, on display, one of the things that I've done is, I've always tried to become more informed, to try to educate myself concerning different things. I find that it is very easy to find things that I agree with or that agree with what I already hold. I really like to go ahead and to find people that will challenge my thought and will pull me, or at least educate me. Up here we have a book on the Chinese massacre. We have a book about the KKK activities in La Grande. We have some books here, and I'll explain them in a little bit. But these are all books that I've tried to go ahead and incorporate into my lifestyle to challenge myself. Because it's real easy for me to give myself permission to be prejudiced and to not seek an understanding. I want to deal with each one of the four dynamics. Our history with the Nez Perce tribe certainly shows our disdain and disregard for the Native Americans who lived here. As the Oregon Trail brought an influx of white men into the Nez Perce territory, many took note of this beauty and the potential of the valley, and they took side on taking the land for their own use. In 1855, the Treaty of Walla Walla carved out a reservation for the Nez Perce. It encompassed 7.7 million acres of land and included the Wallowa Valley. But something happened. Gold was discovered nearby, and there was a rush of new settlers that came into Northeast Oregon. In 1863, the U.S. government proposed a new treaty to the Nez Perce tribe, which would take away 90% of the lands which they had been guaranteed 8 years earlier. The new proposal did not include the Wallowa Valley. A few Nez Perce leaders signed the document. Many did not, including young Chief Joseph. By the way, 180 years old today, he would have been. Chief Joseph, because he had not signed for his people, felt no obligation to keep a treaty which was signed by others. Whites came in and pushed up against the non-treaty tribe members. Tensions were real. In 1873, Joseph negotiated with the government that his people could remain in the Wallowa Valley. In 1877, the government reversed that decision. General Howard was ordered to enforce the government's decision to remove the Nez Perce from the land and move them over to Lapwai, Idaho. Simply put, the whites forced their way onto the Native Americans that lived here. And if we're honest, the rift between the Nez Perce and the whites still remains as an undercurrent for many in this valley. We may welcome them at the Chief Joseph Day's parade. How many times we've cringed when somebody has cried out, "Welcome home! Welcome home!" We may even go out of our way to attend celebrations at the gathering grounds just outside of Wallowa. We may even seek to honor them with a state park named Iwitemlaken to honor Nez Perce history, but we certainly are suspect about their political influences in our rivers and how they use their treaty-given rights for hunting. We don't really want them to inflict their rights upon us. Sometimes dealing with differences is to find ways to honor victims just enough to be able to say, "See how good I am? This ought to show that I'm welcoming," as long as we keep them in their place afterwards. Our history of dealing with the Chinese who lived in our county can be summed up in the history of the Chinese Cove Massacre, dating back to May of 1887. Significant numbers of Chinese laborers came to the U.S. in order to work on the railroad and in other endeavors. When our need of cheap labor was completed, we generally turned on them and told them to live out of sight. Some did. Some sought to find their American dream fulfilled through hard labor and efforts. Some did that by mining for gold. In May of 1887, some adventurous boys from Wallowa County heard that the Chinese miners had worked up thousands of dollars in gold down by the Snake River. And so those adventurous boys rode out to the river where over a period of 2 days they shot, bludgeoned, and mutilated the bodies of miners and dumped them into the Snake River. Largest massacre of Chinese in American history. Secrets don't last long in Wallowa County. And over a short period of time, the deed became known. Not much was done. Just ignore it. But over time, the story got out, and over a year later, there was a trial of sorts. Public opinion and a lack of real investigation led to not guilty pleas, and the story was downplayed, and the official court files were misplaced, not to appear for decades, for there was no point in ruining the image of those boys and their fine families. It was said by one of the individuals who attended the trial, "I guess if they had killed 31 white men, something would have been done about it. But none of the jury knew any of the Chinamen or cared much about it, so they simply turned the men loose." and Wallowa County turned a page and mostly ignored. Nothing was really done until an outsider did a history of the massacre, and folks began to believe that something should be done. In 2004, it was suggested that the site be named Chinese Massacre Site, but county commissioners objected until it was named Chinese Massacre Cove. There were objections to the movement to erect a stone memorializing the event. Locals stated, "Why bring up division and strife again?" But the site was established and set apart was a marker which simply reads, Chinese Massacre Cove, site of the 1887 massacre of as many as 34 Chinese gold miners. No one was ever held accountable. Sometimes dealing with differences is to deflect, ignore, and pretend that it's not really an issue. In 2008, I began to read about a place called Maxville. Maxville was an old timber town north of Wallowa. There was a gal, Gwen, who was striving to establish the Maxville Heritage Interpretive Center. It was dedicated to resurrecting the memory and then telling the story of Maxville, a place where blacks and whites lived near each other, sometimes worked together, and this was a marvel at the time. You see, in the 1920s, there was a logging company, the Bowman Hicks Lumber Company to be specific, and they set out to establish a logging community in our nearby mountains. One of the things that they did was to recruit African-American loggers from the Deep South. This was unheard of. Please remember that the Oregon Constitution of the time still had an exclusion clause in it which forbade any black families to come into Oregon to establish residency or to find jobs. I'll put a little note here. The Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation made those laws moot, but Oregonians carried them as official laws of the state until 1926. And that law stated that if any blacks should come into the state of Oregon and seek to establish residency, that every 6 months they were not off our land. They were entitled to 39 lashes. That clause would be on the official books of the state until 1926. And here it was, a handful of years before that law was rescinded, watching as a town was being built and black families were being invited to come and live in it. Mind you, it still was a segregated community. A town of some 400 with a black population of 50 to 60 or so folks. They had 2 schools, 2 churches, they had different events, although they did from time to time find reason to merge events for the best interests. You already know what it is. They merged their baseball teams together so they could win championships. The Great Depression, downturn in the lumber market would close Maxville in the 1930s. A few of the families stayed in the county, but the majority moved on to establish their lives and fortunes elsewhere. I honestly haven't done too much other study of African Americans in Wallowa County, but I'm still aware of some of the prejudices that are firmly ensconced here. And we all know that we have a very small African American population. But I did take note in the past few years. I was intrigued by the Black Lives Matter movement. It brought up, yet again, a yearning in me to know more about black and white prejudice. On the surface, it's in a knee-jerk reaction. I was among those people who first proclaimed, all lives matter. And in reality, that's what I do believe. But I was also confronted by the knowledge gained from a friend of mine. My friend Tom, who I hope someday to bring to a Fishtrap meeting, was a college friend, dear friend. He found out after a number of years and doing some family research that he was related to the family in America who gained the most financially through the slave trade. He wrote a book called Inheriting the Trade. He talked about all the advantages that his family gained because of the finances that were born because of the selling of blacks. He wrote this book. He wrote the other one called Gather at the Table. They are tremendous books, and I highly recommend them for going ahead and confronting issues that include white privilege and what it means. Tom, more than anyone that I've ever known, was confronted with the knowledge that his life was radically changed by the fact that his family had gained profit from the sin of slavery. And although we as a people can take pride in the fact that the Union won the Civil War and President Lincoln signed that Emancipation Proclamation, those of us who lived in the 50s and 60s certainly could attest to the fact that equality was one thing on paper and another thing in real life. The Black Lives Matter movement, it was a reaction to the evils that continue to be pressed upon black Americans, much of which can be attributed back to the issue of slavery. I emailed a couple of my friends, one black, one white, and asked them to recommend books for me to read from perspectives others than mine. And they did, and I did some work. And then I thought again about my reaction to it. I'm going to go ahead and share a little excursus here. Colin Kaepernick, who chose to kneel down during the national anthem. Why? To bring attention to social ills that still are experienced in the black community. Find that a significant part of our society refused to deal with the issues that he sought to raise. And they decided that they would change by deflecting the discussion, by stating that anyone who knelt during the national anthem was an enemy of our culture. I can remember many in our county who swore that they would never have anything to do with Nike again because Colin Kaepernick was one of the spokespersons. Fascinating, in the past few weeks, we had a gymnasium burned down. Who provided free uniforms and shoes and was declared absolutely wonderful? Nike. How often we deal with differences, and those differences and how we deal with them can be summed up in, if we can agree to principles of differences, we can do that as long as they don't really require us to change our lives. And if we can, let's deflect issues of differences so that we can avoid dealing with them. And 3, we can allow our thoughts and actions to be determined by deciding what's in it for me. A few years ago, I decided to study some of the history of the KKK. History of the KKK in LeGrand was written. I just want to tell you, it's dry and boring for the most part. But it tells of prejudices that caused the locals to band together. It wasn't so much a prejudice against blacks, but against Chinese and Roman Catholics. They were befuddled as to what to do with the large Mormon population of LeGrand, actually 1/3 of the population, who wanted to join the invisible empire. Yes, there were some key things that KKK did in Northeast Oregon was to make known who was associated and dreaded with the dreaded Church of Rome. And it sought to entice people into their membership. I want to read this. This was an advertisement in the Chieftain. If you are a native-born white American citizen having the best interests of your community, city, state, and nation at heart, owing no allegiance to any foreign nation or government, political party, sect, order, ruler, and engaged in a legitimate occupation, and believe in the following principles and ideals: the tenets of the Christian religion, the maintenance of white supremacy, the protection of our pure womanhood, just laws and liberty for all, closer relationships to pure Americanism, undying allegiance to the stars and stripes above all, the upholding of the Constitution of the United States, sovereignty of our state, separation of state and church, freedom of speech and press, closer relationship between capital and American labor, preventing the cause of mob violence and lynchings, preventing unwarranted strikes by foreign labor agitators, prevention of fires and destruction of property by lawless elements, the limitation of foreign immigration, the much-needed local reform of law and order, then you're invited to become a member of the most powerful, secret, non-political fraternal organization in existence today. One that is the most sublime lineage in history. One that was here yesterday, is here today, and will be here forever. For further information, write the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, P.O. Box 624, Enterprise, Oregon.
What's the date on that?
1924. Can you resonate with some of the things that are being said today? If a diner would hire a Catholic to do dishes, then the KKK would encourage a boycott of the eatery. They would publish businesses that were KKK approved. Overall, KKK became quite powerful throughout Oregon, and they saw themselves as an upholder of morality. I do want to go ahead and share this one, though. In their official minutes, if you married Klansmen insist on going out with another man's wife, be awfully sure that she doesn't belong to another Klansman. You may have an occasion to meet that gentleman in the clapper, and I'm sure it would be a very embarrassing position for each of you.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. After a while, the political power and the maneuverings of the KKK were simply no longer tolerated, although we know it became active in some areas and still is active in the most radical beliefs concerning white supremacy. Sometimes we deal with differences through economic pressures. Sometimes we do it by simply desiring that everybody become like us and only associating with those like us. Economic pressures, if you're pro-life, you might be drawn into the call to boycott Starbucks. If you're pro-choice, you might be drawn into the call to boycott Chick-fil-A. And both sides participating in the boycott will declare the other end of the pendulum idiots for doing the same as they. Sometimes we deal with differences by making sure that we congregate with our own kind. And we do tend to congregate with our own kind. Back in my sociology class, we call it homogeneity, the state of being the same. We find it comfortable to be with others most like us. I want to go ahead and bring one that is not often thought of. I want to go ahead and share an appreciation for Mike to be brave enough to ask me to speak today. I want to tell you that Mike asking me to speak today caused trouble on two ends of the spectrum. I know that there are people from the faith-based community that is my most common, that are really questioning why in the world I'm doing anything that has Fishtrap associated with it, because that is them. And I also know that there are people from the Fishtrap community that are kind of wondering why in the world they gave this particular preacher the microphone. And that's being honest. It's being honest at saying that all of us carry prejudice. All of us must learn to deal with differences. I want to go ahead and share one more that I thought wasn't interesting. I didn't know it until just a few days ago. In 1994, there were two men, Andy Kerr and John Bailey. They happened to be two of the more influential environmentalists, okay, in our county. And in 1994, after two mills had been shut down and people were very mad at anything called environmental along that line, what they did was they had two dummies hung in effigy. And they put a sign up that basically said, environmentalists can learn a lot from a couple of dummies. Our county basically said, oh, that doesn't really mean anything. They sought to boycott. Those two men were refused services. They couldn't have their cars worked on. People would refuse them. We still face differences, even in such things as how to deal with environment. I'll end with this. How can wolf haters and wolf lovers deal with each other? How can lumbermen and environmentalists get along? What about the one who's wearing a Vote for Bernie hat, who passes a MAGA hat wearing neighbor? How do we deal with the pastor who wears clerical garb, or the Buddhist monk who wears a robe, or the one whose religious group prevents them from saying the Pledge of Allegiance, or the one who is promoting the local marijuana shop, or the local saloon, or is promoting AA? And now, how do we deal with the reality of same-sex marriage, transgender issues, sexual norms, which are antithetical to some belief systems, either conservative or liberal? Or is it possible for those who root for the outlaws, the cougars, and the eagles, and the bulldogs, to be civil to one another inside of a gymnasium or on a playing field? Thank you for listening.
I think there'll be time for questions too, but I want to start, and let's start at the younger ages. Did that ring any bells? Are there stories in your school? Who gets bullied? Who gets bullied? For what? What?
A lot of people get bullied for a lot of things.
What are 3 or 4 things that people get bullied for?
Size.
Huh?
Size.
Size. Yes.
Fake rumors.
What?
Fake rumors.
Fake
Gossip.
rumors.
Okay.
The way you look or talk.
The way you look or talk?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Yes.
Popularity.
Popularity. Yeah. Who decides who's popular? And who else gets bullied? How does bullying play out in the school? What happens to the person who gets bullied? Do they get isolated? Huh? Made to feel different? Kind of like Nancy's chickens, right? They find one that's a little bit different and all the other chickens jump on that one. Okay, how about from the rest of the people here? What did David's talk stimulate in your thoughts about your own past? Or yes, I mean.
My dad was in Japan during the Second World War, and he never, ever talked about that experience, although it was clearly very painful, until his granddaughter was doing a class project and wanted to talk to her grandfather. So around the dinner table, she asked him what it was like and what his experience was. He loved that child deeply and could not overlook that question, and he burst into tears and sobbed and sobbed and sobbed and collected himself and then didn't talk anymore. So I'm just thinking about how brave and healing it is for you to talk as candidly as you did. Thank you very much for doing that.
Yeah, well, how many of us have somebody in World War II? Yes, Angie.
My dad was in the South Pacific.
He was in the South Pacific. How were his attitudes? How did that?
You know, I never saw, I mean, I lived in the Rogue Valley, that was pretty white. So I don't know. He didn't talk about it much either. Except I do remember one time, and this isn't a due to prejudice, but something loud hit, and my dad hit the ground, and he kind of apologized for that. But I do remember in the Rogue Valley in the 50s, there was a choir that came through, I think, for our church, and they were probably from the South, but they were black. And they had to end the concert. They couldn't do any more encores because they had to be out of the valley in the 50s before sundown.
Yeah, Mike. By the way, should we get a microphone?
I could speak up.
You can speak up.
So my dad was a commercial artist and moved from the Bay Area, West Coast, to New York City to kind of make his fortune and work. And he experienced a great deal of discrimination there as a Chinese man. And at that point, the Chinese Exclusion Act was still being enforced. And so Chinese were not allowed to become U.S. citizens. And one of the exceptions to that was if you went into the military, you would be allowed to become a citizen if you were an officer, became an officer. And so because his art career was kind of getting dead-ended and World War II was breaking out, he joined the Army, and they tested him and realized he was a pretty smart guy, officer quality, and went to officer training school, and simultaneous with his commission as a second lieutenant became a U.S. citizen. He was Chinese, not Japanese. I guess the powers that be could make that distinction. But after becoming an officer, etc., he was not sent to the Pacific. I don't know if that was because of his race. He was sent to North Africa and finished out the war there in campaigns against Germans.
So do the students know, was the military segregated in World War II? Yes. you guys know your military history. They don't, when it gets integrated for Korea, right, in the about 1950. But prior to that time, black troops served with white officers, okay, mostly. And the Japanese served in the, a few of them served as translators and whatnot, but most of them served in Europe. The most decorated soldiers in the United States history were the Japanese soldiers who fought in Europe. I think to this day, isn't it, David? Yeah, yeah. Anything else? Yeah, David.
The thing that came to my mind was our daughter-in-law, who was born in Iran, a member of the Baha'i faith. And the Baha'i faith is a world religion, unity, oneness of humanity, unity of everybody, elimination of prejudice of all sorts. No clergy, because you have an independent investigation of truth that each individual pursues. Well, this is very antithetical to the theocracy in Iran. And so when she was being raised, she would have rocks thrown at her. And, teachers would call her dirty, things like that. Most importantly, the authorities would not allow higher education, and still don't. So her family basically smuggled the older children out into Turkey, if I recall, and they did not see them for about 10 years. And then eventually they were able to get out through Pakistan. And they have all sorts of family here and in Canada. And of course, brain drain, mostly engineers, petrochemical industry, chemical industry, things like that. Their loss, our gain. Extreme religious prejudice, however, and continues to this day. The Iranian authorities in the mid-'80s executed a number of
friends. I was at a meeting one time at a Baha'i gathering, we're Baha'is as well, our whole family is, and the gentleman who was hosting the gathering got a phone call, turned white and sat down, and he had just gotten a call that his brother had been hanged as a Baha'i in Iran. But I hope you get to meet Manoush someday. They come every summer and bring their kids, and her name means sweetness of the moon, and boy is she ever. But she has gotten here even some of the typical, even more subtle comments like, where are you from? She always tells them Sammamish, Washington. But no, where are you really from? Or how long have you been here? And if you've been here that long, why do you still have an accent? And she handles everything with such grace because she looks at every individual, as we do, as if they're a member of her family, her human family. So, and by the way, you're all welcome to come to our home on the third Wednesday of every month, starting the 18th, where we hold a gathering, what we just call meaningful conversations about these issues of oneness and equality and equity, and how we can apply those concepts to the betterment of our own communities. The first one is called Justice and the Prosperity of Humankind. So if you're interested, come talk to me. I'll get your contact information.
So this reminds me of I have to hold myself back because I've got things to say about all of these things. I've now got a family that's got African Americans, Indian Americans, and Filipino Americans in it, and some of them grew up here. But what reminds me of your time, in 1968, I spent a month in Iran evaluating the Peace Corps program there. if you wanted a drink with your dinner, if you wanted a glass of wine, you went to an Armenian or Jewish restaurant because the Muslims couldn't serve alcohol. But there were plenty of Muslims eating food and drinking wine with you in the Armenian or Jewish restaurant, right? And they, for the most part, they all got along pretty well. I spent 2 years in a mixed Turkish-Kurdish village in Turkey, eastern Turkey, 1965 and 1967. There was in the city of Diyarbakir, there was an Armenian section still. And you heard mostly Kurdish on the streets and whatnot. People got along for the most part. They might have chided each other, they ribbed each other. Well, you got to go to one of our restaurants to get a drink, huh? They might have done that. But then what happens, and what happens is somebody lights a match. Or as somebody said about the conflict in Sarajevo, when chaos hits, the thugs take over. And then it's your thugs or our thugs. And you choose a side. So all that time, my city in Diyarbakir, Turkey now, the Armenian section is gone. The Kurds were routed out of there. If you Google Diyarbakir, you'll see a destroyed city. That was a city of 100,000 people. It's been riddled because of the Kurdish-Turkish exchanges. There are a lot of reasons for that, but the one reason that I think that is common is this thing about a match. That if you have people who generally, like in Wallowa County, we generally get along pretty well, but it used to be that Chief Joseph days was the match for anti-Indian stuff. Okay? Fortunately, that's no longer true. And I think that we've learned a lot of things, like 20 years ago, gay marriage was, there were 5% of Americans who approved of it. And now it's like 70%. And, no matter what your religious beliefs are, the fact is that many people now have gay members in their family, or among their close friends, or in your case, among a teacher and a close friend. So we realize the humanity in that. And many of us now have families that include people that are brown and black and Chinese and Japanese and all that stuff. So hopefully as we move out from that. But that's my part of my sermon today, David. I had to get that out. And I just saying one more thing. My grandson is a freshman at Eastern Oregon College. For those of you who, he is a little bit brown. His father was from India. He grew up here. I didn't realize how isolated he felt. He was a hell of a football player. And so that got him by. But when he went to LeGrand to the college, which is 25% non-white, it was like somebody took a leaden jacket off him and threw it open. He said, my Lord, there are people here who look a little bit like me. And it was just, and that's what more of Oregon's going to look like as we go forward, I think. Anyway, so I've done with my sermon. That's enough of me. So yes, Arubo.
Well, that reminded me of my grandchildren who went to high school here in Enterprise, and their mom's from Puerto Rico. So my son was an excellent athlete too, and just had quite a cluster of friends, and was very popular and got along fine. But with the girls, my granddaughter just couldn't connect with them, and they just really isolated her pretty much. She had some guys that were friends, so she came to Portland and lived with me her last 2 years of high school and graduated from Cleveland and was a star on the volleyball team. They won the 5A league that year, and her teammates voted her best offensive player, and she just got along fine with it because that was a very integrated school, and she got along fine.
Is it harder for girls? Girls?
Is it harder for girls?
Why is it harder for girls? Yes.
I guess people just have a lot more expectations for you. Like, sometimes you'll try to, like, I've seen some girls say things that they thought was funny, and the guys would just look at you like, really? but then sometimes it's harder because you have to look a certain way to get certain people's attention. Like there's some really rude people and they'll definitely ridicule you on how you look, and then once they figure out what your weak spot is, they'll ridicule you on how you feel and why you're feeling that way. So girls play it a little bit nastier than men, I guess.
Girls get a little bit nastier treatment than boys. Do you boys agree with that? Huh? You don't know? Huh? You're not going to comment? Hey, Glenn.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about bullying and the pecking order. And there's a really interesting TED Talk that covers chickens in pecking order. There's not a lot of difference between people and chickens. But they decided to do some selective breeding on it, or at least dividing generation after generation. Very interesting what happened on both groups. Great lesson for democracy. You'll want to watch that. Sorry, I don't have the data, but it's on TED Talk.
Okay, any more? Right here and then Kelly.
So I'm hoping education has changed. I think it has. When we went to school at Washington State, I was an exceptional student in history, and I got admitted to the master's program without application because of my grades and my attentiveness, until I decided to get engaged to my future husband. And I walked into my advisor and didn't say a word, but I had a ring on, and he suggested I major in elementary education and call it square. I was no longer in the program.
I went to an all-60s reunion at my college and heard that story so many times. Women who were confident and yes. Well, Kelly first and then Nancy.
No, go ahead, Nancy.
Okay, go ahead, Nancy.
Sure. Yes. Kind of the elephant in the room for me is that we are talking about our political differences and the amount of discomfort and strife and anger and even some rudeness that it is, and it seems at this point in time to have gotten a little more, even more challenging than perhaps 20 years ago or something. But I just think we need a minute to consider, how do we deal with people that have a real different point of view than we do in terms of what our country should look like, how we should be governed, how we should live in our civil democracy, and how we express those differences.
Kelly.
Well, and hi everyone, I'm Kelly Sheehy. I work here as the development director, and I first of all wanted to thank David so much and to thank Fishtrap for providing us with this platform to talk about these issues, because really just discussion is key. And what I'm hearing is stories that are drastically different from one another about experiencing discrimination, whether you're a young student or your grandfather experienced discrimination, and what that makes you feel is shame. And shame closes you up, right? There was a lot of people that said, well, he didn't talk about it. He never talked about it after that. And so what I would like you to encourage you to do, and what Fishtrap is doing and what David is doing is talking about it. So continue the discussion as you go home. Talk about how that makes you feel. Talk about it with other kids. Don't let someone say something to you and that makes you feel ashamed of yourself, and makes you feel like you can't share that. Because when you share it, when we talk about this, that gives us all this sense of freedom. Then it loses its power over us. So I do want to thank you, David, and thank you, Fishtrap, and thank you, everyone, for being part of this discussion. And please do continue this.
Thank you. David, I wanted to ask the kids one more question, then I'll turn it over to you. I heard rumors about literature, white supremacy literature on the Enterprise campus. Has anybody heard anything about that? I don't want to. Yes.
secondhand information, but a couple of children with religious differences are getting swastikas printed on their notebooks and are asked.
In Enterprise? Yeah. So, Baker City kids, do you have any literature? Are there pressures? Boys especially are getting this pressure right now. Okay? We know that boys are getting literature about you've got to stand up for white. And I, you know, I've seen things online. I've seen this stuff, but if you see any of that kind of literature, bring it to your teachers. Okay? Bring it to your instructors or your minister. David,
I don't want to be an answer man, but I do hope. I think all of this is good. We brought out a whole lot of, well, this has happened, this has happened, this has happened. Can I just suggest my approach on a few things? One is, you know, how do we deal with differences? First of all, don't become a closed person. Be an open person. Being open and trying to understand the old adage of walking in their shoes. Don't be afraid of learning what other people's experiences are. Don't be afraid of learning what their thoughts are. They may be antithetical to what you hold. That still does not mean that you have to accept what they hold. But you need to understand where people are coming from in order to go ahead and to do that. Be open. We miss it. We miss the public square. You know, why are we so, you know, opposed? And I'll simply go ahead and do this. I am under fire from some of the people from my congregation because I am absolutely pointing out the fallacies of the extreme right and extreme left in politics. And I'm telling my people, do not put your faith in an elephant or a donkey. Okay? If you are a part of the church, you are to put your faith in the Lamb. Okay? And if we can approach it biblically, now some of you don't care about the Christian faith, and that's fine. Okay? That's fine. But I hope that you know enough about it so that you can understand that there are some of us that are not radical so that we can go ahead and say, this is what all Christians believe. Because that is as false as saying that all Muslims are Islamists. Okay? So be open. Be open. Study. Make yourself, you know, do your own training. And again, it is so easy. When I go into a bookstore, I love to get those books that agree with me. That's why I forced myself over the years to contact people and say, you tell me what book you want me to read. And sometimes I despise those books, but I can also learn from many of them. Okay? And so be open and continue to grow, continue to study and to do that. What do we do about differences? Travel. Travel. Get to know other people. Get to know other cultures. 2 weeks ago, I was on a southern island in Chile, 1,200 people that the world doesn't care about at all. And I cut wood for them, and I helped dig potatoes for them, and I did that, and I got into their homes, and I got bed bugs, and I got all of those wonderful things. Okay? And I got to know them as what? People. People. Okay? Travel, get to know other groups. Don't be so homogenized that you're afraid to learn the positive things of others. Okay? And again, they don't have to be in, quote, the camp that you are ending up in. I thank God I don't only have Christian friends. Okay? You know, along that line. You know, and the other one that I would come around and say is, you know, what do we do about differences? When somebody calls you, say, I'd love to work with you, Mike. Because if he's honest, he knows that I'm in a different camp than some of his normal folks. And I know that by my answering his phone call and saying, I'll work with you, that automatically puts a different spin on it. Okay? If we're real honest, we are in the same community. There's a lot of stuff about Mike that I really like. So far, I haven't learned anything I don't like. Okay? And if we can learn to merge our circles together and to acknowledge that there are differences, but don't throw people out for minor differences. Okay? Even some major ones that you can overlook on the fact that we are all made by one creator. My theology, you are all children of God. And if I believe that, then you have value and worth, and I cannot toss you out of my circle. If we can remember those things, which is common to a lot of different religions, then we will come to an understanding of what can we do. I hope this has been meaningful. Thank you.